She was 14 when they dressed her in silk and gold, when they took away her name and told her she would become a queen. They painted her face with powder white as snow, laced her into corsets that stole her breath, and whispered that she must smile, always smile, for the eyes of France were watching. But no one told her that crowns were made of thorns. No one warned her that palaces could become prisons, or that the people who cheered her arrival would one day call for her blood. Marie Antoinette never wanted to be a symbol. She only wanted to be a girl, then a woman, then a mother. But history had other plans. Her story is not the fairy tale they sold to the world. It is something far stranger, far sadder, and far more human. Tonight, as the world grows quiet and the shadows lengthen, let us walk beside her through the gilded halls of Versailles, through the gardens where she hid from the weight of a kingdom, through the revolution that swallowed her whole. This is the story of a woman who became a ghost long before she died. Before we step into her world, I want you to know something. These stories are made to carry you softly toward rest, to fill the quiet hours with voices from the past who once breathed and dreamed just as you do now. If this tale brings you comfort, if it helps you drift a little closer to sleep, then stay a while. Let this space be a refuge. Subscribe, not because you must, but because these nights are meant to be shared. And now, with the evening settling around us like a cloak, let us begin. Vienna in autumn smelled of chestnuts and wood smoke, of gardens turning gold and rivers running cold beneath stone bridges. The Hofburg Palace rose like a mountain in the heart of the city, its walls thick enough to hold centuries of secrets, its corridors long enough to lose yourself in. And somewhere in those corridors, in a room filled with sunlight and the sound of a harpsichord, a little girl was learning how to disappear. Her name was Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna. 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa, Archduchess of Austria, a girl born into a family so vast that her own mother sometimes forgot which daughter she was calling for. She had pale skin that flushed easily, hair the color of honey, eyes that were neither quite blue nor quite gray but something softer, something that changed with the light. She was not particularly clever, her tutor said. Not particularly graceful. She stumbled over Latin, daydreamed through history lessons, and had a terrible habit of laughing when she should have been silent. But she could sing. And she could dance. And when she played the harp, her fingers moving over the strings like water over stones, even her mother would pause in the doorway and listen. But empresses do not have time for music. They have time only for empire. And Maria Theresa, who had inherited a throne no woman was supposed to hold, who had fought wars and brokered treaties and bent the crowned heads of Europe to her will, understood something her youngest daughter did not yet know. Power was not about being loved. It was about being useful. And Maria Antonia, this small bright girl who preferred gardens to politics and stories to strategy, was about to become very useful indeed. France was the enemy. It had always been the enemy. For generations, Austria and France had circled each other like wolves, bleeding each other dry in wars that carved borders and crushed villages and left mothers weeping over sons who would never come home. But Maria Theresa was tired of war. And so she would do what empresses have always done when swords fail. She would offer a daughter. The King of France had a grandson, a boy named Louis Auguste, awkward and shy and destined to wear a crown. If that boy could be married to an Austrian archduchess, if their blood could be joined, then perhaps two nations might finally find peace. The alliance would be sealed not with ink, but with a wedding. Not with diplomats, but with a child. Maria Antonia was 12 years old when they told her. She did not understand at first. Marriage was something that happened to older sisters, to women with straight spines and careful smiles who knew how to curtsy without trembling. But her mother's voice left no room for questions. You will go to France, the Empress said, her words as firm as stone. You will marry the Dauphin. You will become French in every way that matters. And you will make me proud. The little girl nodded. Because what else could she do? You did not argue with an empress. You did not cry in front of a woman who had buried 11 of her 16 children and never once let her face betray the grief. So Maria Antonia swallowed her fear, pressed her hands together to stop them shaking, and tried to imagine what France might look like. She had heard it was beautiful. She had heard the palace at Versailles was a miracle of glass and gold, that the gardens stretched for miles, that the king lived like a god among mortals. She tried to picture herself there, tried to see herself as someone important, someone who mattered. But all she could see was a girl in a room that was growing darker, a girl whose childhood had just been sold for peace. The next 2 years were a slow erasure. They took away her language first, forbidding her to speak German, drilling her in French until her tongue ached and her accent softened into something that might pass as Parisian. They taught her to dance the way French women danced, to curtsy the way French women curtsied, to smile with her lips closed because her teeth were not quite straight and the French court would notice. They brought in hairdressers to tame her hair, doctors to inspect her body, dressmakers to measure every inch of her so that gowns could be sent ahead to France, so that when she arrived she would already look like she belonged. Her mother watched all of this with the cold eye of a general preparing a soldier for battle. Maria Theresa wrote letters, dozens of them, instructions on how her daughter must behave, warnings about the dangers of vanity and frivolity, reminders that she was not going to France to be happy but to serve. "You are the bond between two great nations," the Empress wrote. "Do not forget what you owe to Austria. Do not forget that every choice you make reflects on me." Maria Antonia read these letters late at night, when the palace was silent and the candles burned low. She read them until the words blurred, until she could recite them from memory, until they became a voice inside her head that never stopped whispering. Be perfect. Be French. Be everything they need you to be. And slowly, quietly, Maria Antonia began to fade. In her place, something new was being built. Something polished and careful and so very fragile. She said goodbye to her brothers and sisters one by one, though she could not remember all their names. She kissed her father's hand and tried not to cry when he looked at her with eyes that seemed already to have forgotten her face. She packed her favorite books, her harp, a small wooden box that held a lock of her mother's hair. And then, in the spring of 1770, when the cherry trees were blooming and the air smelled of rain and new grass, she climbed into a carriage and left Vienna forever. The journey took weeks. Through forests and over mountains, past villages where people lined the roads to watch the Archduchess pass, their faces curious and distant as if she were a creature from a storybook and not a girl who was terrified she might be sick all over the velvet seats. She traveled with an entourage of diplomats and servants, with trunks full of gowns she had never worn and jewels she had never chosen, with letters of introduction and dowries worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. But none of it was hers. Not really. It all belonged to the alliance. To the promise she was meant to keep. At the border between Austria and France, they built a pavilion. It was a strange, temporary thing, half on one side, half on the other, decorated with silk and flowers and the two flags hanging side by side. And it was here, in this no man's land between nations, that Maria Antonia would be transformed. She stepped inside wearing an Austrian gown, her hair dressed in the Viennese style, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. They undressed her. Every piece of clothing, every ribbon, every pin. They took it all away, leaving her standing there in nothing but her skin, shivering not from cold but from the weight of what was happening. And then they dressed her again. In French silk. French lace. French jewels. When she stepped out the other side, she was no longer an Archduchess of Austria. She was the Dauphine of France. And Maria Antonia was gone. Versailles appeared on the horizon like a dream made of stone and light. The carriage moved slowly along the avenue, flanked by guards in gleaming armor, and through the windows she could see it growing larger, impossibly larger, until the palace seemed to swallow the sky itself. 3 stories of pale golden walls, hundreds upon hundreds of windows catching the afternoon sun, gardens that stretched beyond sight, fountains spraying silver arcs of water into pools lined with marble statues. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was a place where a girl of 14 could vanish entirely and no one would even notice she was gone. The people came out to see her. Thousands of them, lining the roads, pressing against the gates, craning their necks for a glimpse of the new Dauphine. They cheered. They threw flowers. They called her name, or the name they thought was hers now, their voices rising in a wave of sound that made her hands shake in her lap. Marie Antoinette. Not Maria Antonia. Never again Maria Antonia. She smiled because she had been taught to smile, waved because her mother's letters had told her she must always wave, and tried not to think about how far away Vienna was, how completely she had been cut off from everything she had ever known. Inside the palace, the air smelled of perfume and candle wax and something else, something faintly sour that she would later learn was the smell of too many people living too close together, of chamber pots and unwashed bodies hidden beneath silk and powder. The corridors were endless, a maze of mirrors and gilt and paintings of kings and queens who stared down at her with eyes that seemed to follow wherever she went. Courtiers appeared from every doorway, bowing, curtsying, murmuring words she could barely understand through her nervousness. Their faces were masks of white powder, their lips painted red, their wigs piled so high they seemed in danger of toppling over. And everyone was watching. Everyone. They brought her to a room where she would meet her husband for the first time. Louis Auguste. The boy who would one day be king, the boy she was supposed to love, the boy her entire future depended on. She had seen his portrait, of course. A round face, a weak chin, eyes that looked kind but uncertain. Her mother had written that he was shy, that he was not particularly handsome but that beauty mattered less than duty, that Marie Antoinette must be patient with him, must guide him gently, must never forget that her role was to win his affection and bind him to Austria's interests. The door opened. He walked in. And her heart sank. He was 16, tall and thick-shouldered, with hands too large for his body and a posture that seemed to fold in on itself as if he wanted to take up as little space as possible. His face was flushed, his wig slightly crooked, and when he looked at her his eyes darted away almost immediately, fixing on the floor, on the wall, on anything but the girl standing before him in her borrowed French gown. He mumbled something that might have been a greeting. She curtsied, her legs trembling, and whispered the response she had practiced 100 times. And then there was silence. A long, awful silence that seemed to stretch on forever while the courtiers watched and the candles flickered and neither of them knew what to say. They were married 2 days later in the palace chapel, in a ceremony so grand and so elaborate that she remembered almost none of it afterward. She remembered the weight of the gown, the heaviness of the crown they placed on her head, the way her voice shook when she spoke her vows. She remembered the archbishop's hands, cold and dry, pressing hers together with Louis Auguste's, binding them before God and France and 30,000 witnesses. She remembered thinking that this was supposed to be the most important day of her life, and all she wanted was for it to be over. The wedding feast lasted for hours. Course after course of food she could not eat, her stomach too tight with anxiety, her corset too restrictive to allow more than a few bites. Nobles came forward one by one to offer their congratulations, their names and titles blurring together into meaningless sound. She smiled until her face ached. Louis Auguste sat beside her, silent and sweating, occasionally glancing at her and then looking away as if he had been caught doing something shameful. And when the feast finally ended, when the musicians stopped playing and the guests began to disperse, they were led to the marriage bed. The bedroom was enormous, hung with tapestries that depicted scenes of mythological love, Cupid and Psyche, Venus and Adonis, stories where passion always triumphed and hearts always found their way. The bed itself was draped in crimson silk, large enough for 6 people, raised on a platform so that even in sleep the Dauphin and Dauphine would be elevated above ordinary mortals. Servants undressed her, their hands quick and impersonal, removing the layers of lace and brocade until she stood in nothing but a thin white nightgown that made her feel more exposed than nakedness. Louis Auguste was brought in from the other side, dressed in his own nightclothes, his face red, his eyes fixed firmly on the ceiling. The Archbishop of Reims blessed the bed. Courtiers lined the walls, witnesses to ensure the marriage would be consummated, that the alliance would be sealed in the most final way possible. Marie Antoinette climbed into bed, her hands clutching the sheets, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. Louis Auguste climbed in beside her, careful not to touch her, leaving a wide space between their bodies as if an invisible wall had been built down the center of the mattress. The curtains were drawn. The courtiers withdrew. And nothing happened. Louis Auguste lay on his back, breathing heavily, staring at the canopy above them. Marie Antoinette lay perfectly still, not knowing what she was supposed to do, whether she was supposed to speak or stay silent, whether this terrible waiting was normal or a sign that something was already wrong. Minutes passed. Then an hour. And finally, Louis Auguste turned on his side, his back to her, and went to sleep. She did not sleep. She lay there in the darkness, listening to his breathing, feeling the weight of the crown she was no longer wearing but could still feel pressing down on her head. And she wondered if this was what the rest of her life would be. Silence. Distance. A marriage that existed only on paper, a partnership with no warmth, no tenderness, no connection at all. The next morning, courtiers asked with barely concealed eagerness whether the marriage had been consummated. Louis Auguste mumbled something and walked away. Marie Antoinette said nothing, her cheeks burning with shame she did not fully understand. And so began the rumors. Whispers that traveled through Versailles like wildfire, that spread to Paris, that eventually reached all the way back to Vienna where her mother read the reports with growing fury. The Dauphine was failing. The marriage was unconsummated. Austria's hopes rested on a girl who could not even manage the most basic duty of a wife. Letters arrived from Empress Maria Theresa, each one sharper than the last. "You must try harder," her mother wrote. "You must find a way to win his affection. Everything depends on this. Do not fail me." Marie Antoinette read the letters and felt something inside her begin to crack. She was 14 years old. She was alone in a palace of strangers. Her husband would not touch her, the court whispered about her behind fans and closed doors, and her mother, thousands of miles away, blamed her for all of it. So she did what she had always done when the world became too much. She retreated into herself. Into music and dancing, into the small pleasures that made the days bearable. She played cards with the other young women of the court, laughing too loudly at jokes that were not funny, staying up until dawn because sleep meant facing another empty bed, another night of rejection. She spent money on gowns and jewels, not because she cared about fashion but because choosing fabrics and ribbons gave her something to control when everything else was spiraling away from her. And she smiled. Always smiled. Because that was what Dauphines did. They smiled and they endured and they never, ever let anyone see them break. But late at night, when the palace was finally quiet and the candles burned low, Marie Antoinette would stand at her window and look out over the gardens of Versailles, over the geometrically perfect hedges and the fountains that never stopped flowing, and she would wonder if anyone in this golden cage had ever been happy. If happiness was even possible in a place like this. Or if she had been sent here not to live, but simply to be displayed. A pretty ornament. A symbol of peace. A girl who had been promised to France and had nothing left to give. 7 years. 7 years of waiting for a marriage to begin, for a husband to look at her with something other than awkward politeness, for a life that felt less like performance and more like living. 7 years of waking up each morning to the same routine, the same rituals, the same suffocating sense that she was trapped inside a play where everyone knew their lines except her. The court of Versailles operated according to rules so ancient and so rigid that they had calcified into something beyond tradition, something closer to religion. Every moment was choreographed. Every gesture had meaning. And Marie Antoinette, who had been a spontaneous child, a girl who laughed too loudly and ran when she should have walked, found herself imprisoned by etiquette. The day began with the lever, the ritual of rising. Servants would enter her bedroom in strict order of rank, each one with a specific task, a specific moment when they were allowed to approach. The highest-ranking noblewoman present would hand her the chemise, the undershirt that went on first. But if a higher-ranking woman arrived even seconds later, the chemise had to be passed back, transferred through a chain of hands until it reached the person whose bloodline gave her the right to dress the Dauphine. Marie Antoinette would stand there, shivering in the cold morning air, her arms crossed over her bare chest, waiting while duchesses and princesses argued over who had precedence. 15 minutes. Sometimes 20. All for a piece of fabric that could have been put on in seconds if anyone had been allowed to simply hand it to her directly. Then came breakfast, though she was rarely hungry. Then audiences with people she did not know and would never see again, endless streams of courtiers who came to pay their respects, to be seen in her presence, to check her face for signs of pregnancy that never came. Then walks in the gardens, always surrounded by attendants, never alone, every step watched and reported back to the gossips who fed on scandal the way flowers feed on sun. Then dinner, another elaborate performance where she sat at a table surrounded by hundreds of people who stared at her while she tried to eat, where every bite she took was noted, every sip of wine analyzed for hidden meaning. And through it all, Louis Auguste remained a stranger. He was kind to her, in his way. He never raised his voice, never said a cruel word, never treated her with anything but distant courtesy. But he did not want her. That much was clear. He spent his days hunting, his evenings working on locks in his workshop, tinkering with mechanisms and keys while she sat alone in her apartments, waiting for a husband who never came. The bed between them remained a cold, empty space. And the entire court knew it. The whispers grew louder. 7 years without a child was not just unusual, it was scandalous. It was proof that something was wrong, that the alliance was cursed, that Marie Antoinette was failing in the only task that truly mattered. Anonymous pamphlets appeared in Paris, crude drawings that depicted her as barren, as defective, as a woman whose womb was as empty as her head. The Austrian whore, they called her. The do-nothing Dauphine. And there was nothing she could do but endure it, smile through it, pretend that the words did not cut her every single time. Her mother's letters became weapons. "I hear nothing but complaints about you," Maria Theresa wrote. "You care only for pleasure and amusement. You neglect your duties. You spend too much money. You stay up too late. You do not try hard enough with your husband." Each sentence was a blade, slipping between her ribs, reminding her that even thousands of miles away, she was being watched, judged, found wanting. Marie Antoinette would read these letters and feel the old familiar panic rising in her chest, the sense that she was drowning and no one would throw her a rope. So she built her own world. If Versailles would not let her be happy, she would create happiness in the spaces they could not control. She gathered around her a circle of friends, young women who were not bound by the suffocating protocols of the older generation, who laughed at her jokes and danced with her until dawn and did not care that she was failing as a wife because they saw her, finally, as a person. She threw herself into fashion, ordering gowns in colors that had never been seen at court before, commissioning hairstyles so elaborate they required scaffolding, feathers, flowers, even miniature ships perched on top of her head. The court was scandalized. Her mother was furious. But for the first time since arriving in France, Marie Antoinette felt like she had some small measure of control. She gambled. Not because she loved cards, but because the gaming tables were the only place where time moved differently, where hours could pass in a blur of shuffled decks and whispered bets, where she could focus on something other than the emptiness of her marriage and the weight of everyone's expectations. She lost fortunes. Thousands of livres in a single night, sums that would have fed villages, that would have kept families alive for years. But money meant nothing to her. It was not real. None of this was real. She was playing a part in a theater where the curtain never came down, and if spending gold made the performance easier to bear, then she would spend until the coffers ran dry. She danced. God, how she danced! At balls that lasted until the sun rose, spinning through minuets and contradances with partners who held her a little too close, who whispered things that made her blush and laugh and forget, just for a moment, that she was the Dauphine of France and not simply a girl who loved music and movement and the feeling of being alive. The older courtiers clucked their tongues and wrote letters to the king, complaining that she was undignified, that she was setting a bad example, that her behavior was unbecoming of a future queen. But Marie Antoinette did not care. Or rather, she cared too much, and dancing was the only thing that made the caring stop. And then there was the Petit Trianon. A small chateau on the grounds of Versailles, gifted to her by Louis XVI after his grandfather's death finally made them king and queen. It was hers. Truly hers. A place where she could escape the endless eyes of the court, where she could walk in gardens that felt almost natural, almost wild, where she could pretend, just for a few hours, that she was not a queen at all but simply a woman with a house and a garden and a life that belonged to her. She decorated it in soft colors, pastels and whites, none of the heavy gold and crimson that dominated Versailles. She invited only the people she chose, not the people protocol demanded. And she spent her happiest hours there, reading under trees, playing music with friends, breathing air that did not feel quite so heavy with judgment. But the world would not leave her alone. Even there, even in her sanctuary, the rumors followed. They said she was having affairs. Dozens of them. With courtiers, with guards, with her own brother-in-law. They said the Petit Trianon was a den of debauchery, that she held orgies in the gardens, that she was corrupting the nobility with her Austrian ways. None of it was true. She had never been unfaithful to Louis. Despite everything, despite the coldness and the distance and the years of rejection, she had remained loyal to a marriage that barely existed. But truth did not matter. The people needed a villain, and she was perfect for the role. Paris grew restless. The economy was crumbling, debts from wars that had ended before she was even born, from decades of corruption and mismanagement that had nothing to do with her. But someone had to be blamed. And it was easier to blame a foreign queen who wore diamonds than to admit that the entire system was rotten, that the aristocracy had been bleeding France dry for generations, that the king himself was weak and indecisive and utterly unable to lead. So they blamed Marie Antoinette. For the debt. For the famine. For the price of bread that kept rising while wages stayed the same. She became the symbol of everything wrong with France, the scapegoat for problems she had not created and could not solve. And then, finally, after 7 years of waiting, something changed. A doctor was called. An examination was performed. A minor surgery, they said. Nothing serious. But whatever was done, it worked. Louis came to her bed. Not with passion, not with love, but with the grim determination of a man fulfilling a duty. And 9 months later, in December of 1778, Marie Antoinette gave birth to a daughter. They had wanted a son. Everyone had wanted a son. An heir to secure the throne, to prove that the marriage was not just valid but fruitful, to silence the whispers once and for all. But the baby was a girl, tiny and red-faced and wailing in the midwife's arms. The room fell silent. Disappointment settled over the gathered courtiers like fog. And Marie Antoinette, exhausted and bleeding and barely conscious, looked at her daughter and felt something crack open inside her chest. Love. Raw and fierce and overwhelming. This tiny creature, this girl who was hers, who had come from her body and depended on her for everything. For the first time in 8 years, Marie Antoinette felt connected to something real. Not a role. Not a performance. But an actual person who needed her, who would grow up calling her mother, who might someday understand what it meant to be trapped by a life you never chose. She named her Marie-Therese Charlotte, after her own mother and the patron saint of France. And she poured into this child all the love she had been storing up, all the tenderness that had nowhere else to go. She insisted on nursing the baby herself, a shocking breach of protocol that sent the court into scandalized whispers. Queens did not nurse. Queens had wet nurses, kept their bodies pristine and available for the next pregnancy. But Marie Antoinette did not care. For once, she was going to do what she wanted. For once, she was going to be a mother, not a queen. 2 years later, a son. Louis Joseph, the Dauphin, the heir everyone had been waiting for. The kingdom erupted in celebration. Bells rang across France. Bonfires lit up the night sky. The pressure that had been crushing her for a decade finally lifted, just a little. She had done it. She had given France an heir. And for a brief, shining moment, she thought perhaps everything would be all right now. Perhaps they would finally stop hating her. Perhaps she could finally breathe. But the hatred did not stop. If anything, it grew worse. Because now she was not just the frivolous foreign queen. Now she was the mother, and mothers could be attacked in ways that cut deeper than any insult about fashion or gambling. Pamphlets appeared claiming her children were not the king's, that she had conceived them with lovers, that the Dauphin was a bastard and the succession was a lie. The accusations were insane, easily disproven by anyone who knew the truth, but the truth did not matter. The story was too delicious, too scandalous, too perfect to let facts get in the way. And then her son got sick. Louis Joseph, the beautiful boy with his father's eyes and her smile, began to waste away. His spine curved, his legs weakened, and no doctor could stop it. Tuberculosis of the bone, they said, though they did not really know, could not really explain why a child born healthy should suddenly start dying. Marie Antoinette spent hours by his bedside, reading to him, singing to him, holding his hand while he cried from pain that no medicine could touch. And the court whispered that it was her fault. That her sins had brought a curse down on her children. That God was punishing her for her vanity, her extravagance, her failure to be the queen France deserved. The little Dauphin died in June of 1789. 7 years old. He died while revolution was already stirring in the streets, while Paris was arming itself, while the world Marie Antoinette had known, the only world she had ever been allowed to know, was beginning to collapse. She buried her son. And then she looked up to find that the country was burning. And somehow, it was still her fault. The lie was born in the streets of Paris, whispered from mouth to mouth like a disease, spreading faster than truth ever could. Let them eat cake. 4 words. Simple, cruel, perfectly designed to make a queen into a monster. The people were starving, the story went. Bread had become so expensive that families were choosing between eating and heating their homes, and when someone told Marie Antoinette that her subjects had no bread, she supposedly laughed and said those 4 words. Let them eat cake. As if the poor were simply too stupid to think of alternatives. As if their suffering was a joke to her, a minor inconvenience that could be solved with a more expensive dessert. She never said it. Not once. Not ever. The phrase had appeared in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's writings years before Marie Antoinette even arrived in France, attributed to an unnamed princess from a different era entirely. But facts were inconvenient things, easily discarded when a better story was available. And this story was perfect. It confirmed everything the people already believed about her. That she was out of touch, heartless, a foreigner who cared nothing for French lives. So they repeated it. In taverns and markets, in pamphlets and songs, until the lie became history and Marie Antoinette became the woman who told starving people to eat cake. The truth was more complicated, and far less satisfying. Marie Antoinette had never been political. She had arrived in France as a child bride, trained only to smile and produce heirs, given no education in economics or governance, deliberately kept ignorant because smart women were dangerous and queens were meant to be decorative. She did not understand the debt that was crushing France, the decades of mismanagement and corruption, the wars that had emptied the treasury long before she was born. How could she? No one had ever explained it to her. No one had ever asked her opinion. She was a queen, yes, but a queen with no power, no influence, no role beyond standing in the right place and wearing the right dress. But ignorance was not innocence. Not in the eyes of a hungry population. They looked at Versailles, at the fountains that ran constantly, at the gardens that required armies of workers, at the banquets that could have fed entire villages, and they saw waste. Obscene, unforgivable waste. And at the center of it all was Marie Antoinette, glittering in diamonds, her hair piled high with feathers and ribbons, the very image of everything they despised. It did not matter that she was not responsible for the debt. It did not matter that the financial crisis had roots going back decades, that kings before Louis XVI had spent just as lavishly, that the entire aristocratic system was built on exploitation. She was visible. She was foreign. She was a woman. And that made her the perfect target. The pamphlets were everywhere. Cheap, crude, illustrated with drawings so obscene they would have made a sailor blush. They depicted her in positions with lovers both real and imagined, with women as well as men, with members of the court, with servants, with anyone and everyone. They called her l'Autrichienne, a play on words that turned the Austrian into the Austrian bitch. They accused her of draining the treasury to send money back to Austria, of manipulating her weak husband, of plotting against France with her brother, the emperor. They claimed she held orgies at the Petit Trianon, that she had lesbian affairs with the Princesse de Lamballe, that she was a nymphomaniac, a traitor, a whore. None of it was true. But in revolution, truth is the first casualty. What mattered was the image, the symbol, the idea of Marie Antoinette that had been constructed in the popular imagination. She had become a myth, a monster, something less than human. And once that transformation was complete, once people stopped seeing her as a person and saw only a symbol of oppression, anything became possible. Even murder. The spring of 1789 brought hunger like France had not seen in generations. The previous winter had been brutal, the harvest before that ruined by hailstorms and drought. Bread prices doubled, then tripled. In Paris, people stood in line for hours hoping to buy a single loaf, and often the bakeries ran out before everyone could be served. Riots broke out. Bakeries were looted. Anyone suspected of hoarding grain was attacked in the streets. And the anger that had been building for years, the resentment toward an aristocracy that ate while the people starved, finally found its voice. The Estates General was called for the first time in over a century, a gathering of representatives from the three estates, clergy, nobility, and commoners. It was supposed to solve the financial crisis, to find a way forward that did not involve complete collapse. Instead, it became a powder keg. The Third Estate, representing the common people, declared themselves the National Assembly and demanded real power, real representation, an end to the system that had kept them voiceless for so long. The king hesitated, wavered, made promises he did not keep. And in July, Paris exploded. The Bastille fell on the 14th, that ancient fortress prison that had come to symbolize royal tyranny even though it held only 7 prisoners, none of them political. But symbols mattered more than reality. A mob stormed the walls, killed the guards, paraded the governor's head through the streets on a pike. The revolution had begun. And at Versailles, miles away from the violence, Marie Antoinette heard the news and felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She wanted to flee. Every instinct told her to run, to take her children and disappear into the night before the mob came for them. But Louis would not leave. He was the king. Kings did not run. He believed, with a faith that was almost childlike, that if he just explained things properly, if he just showed the people that he meant well, that he wanted to help, they would calm down and everything would go back to normal. He did not understand that normal was over. That the old world was dying and something new and terrible was being born in its place. Marie Antoinette understood. She had always been quicker than her husband, sharper, more willing to see unpleasant truths. She knew they were in danger. She knew the hatred directed at her was real and deep and possibly insurmountable. But she was trapped. Trapped by her position, by her children who were too young to travel in secret, by a husband who would not listen, by a court that was fracturing into factions, by the simple fact that there was nowhere left to run. Austria would not take her back. Her brother had made that clear in his letters. She had been sent to France to secure an alliance, and if that alliance failed, she was on her own. So she stayed. And she watched as the revolution consumed everything around her. Nobles began fleeing the country, slipping away in the night to seek refuge in Austria, England, anywhere that would take them. The National Assembly stripped away the king's powers one by one, reducing him from an absolute monarch to a figurehead, a man who signed whatever they put in front of him because he was too weak to resist. And Marie Antoinette, who had spent years being criticized for her influence over her husband, now found herself powerless to help him. Every suggestion she made was ignored. Every attempt to rally support was seen as proof of her treachery. The Austrian whore, they said, was trying to manipulate France into war with its own people. October came cold and grey. Rain fell on Versailles, turning the gardens to mud, dripping from the statues and the fountains that no longer ran because there was no money to maintain them. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was thick with dread. Servants whispered about mobs forming in Paris, about women marching toward Versailles with pikes and knives, about plans to storm the palace and drag the royal family back to the capital. Marie Antoinette tried to keep her children calm, tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy even as the walls closed in. On the 5th of October, they came. Thousands of them, mostly women, soaked from the rain and half-mad with hunger and rage. They marched from Paris carrying weapons they had taken from armories, singing songs that called for the Queen's head, chanting slogans that turned her name into a curse. The Flanders Regiment, stationed at Versailles to protect the royal family, stood at attention as the mob approached. But they were outnumbered 10-1, and their loyalty was questionable at best. Many of them sympathized with the revolution. Many of them believed the propaganda about the Austrian whore. The mob surrounded the palace. They broke through the outer gates, flooded into the courtyards, their voices rising in a roar that shook the windows. Marie Antoinette stood in her apartments, her face pale, her hands steady, listening to the sound of her own death approaching. Her ladies-in-waiting were crying. Her guards were arguing about whether to fight or surrender. And somewhere in the chaos, her children were hiding, terrified, waiting for their mother to tell them everything would be all right. Night fell. The mob stayed. They built fires in the courtyards, cooked food they had brought or stolen, sang songs and told stories while they waited for morning. And inside the palace, no one slept. Marie Antoinette sat by the window, watching the flames flicker in the darkness, knowing that tomorrow would change everything. The king met with representatives from the mob, promised them grain, promised reforms, promised anything if they would just go home. But they did not want promises anymore. They wanted the king and queen in Paris, where they could be watched, controlled, where the revolution could keep them as hostages against any attempt at counter-revolution. Dawn came grey and cold. The mob grew restless. Someone found an unlocked door, and suddenly they were inside, pouring through the corridors, smashing mirrors, tearing down tapestries, screaming for the Austrian bitch. Marie Antoinette woke to the sound of doors splintering, of her guards shouting, of footsteps pounding toward her bedroom. She ran. Barefoot, in her nightgown, through secret passages she had memorized years ago when the palace was still a prison but not yet a death trap. Behind her, the mob broke into her room, tore her bed apart looking for her, would have killed her if they had found her. She made it to the king's apartments. Threw herself through the door and fell into Louis's arms, shaking so hard she could barely stand. He held her, this man who had been a stranger for so long, and for the first time in their marriage she felt him truly see her. Not as a queen. Not as a political tool. But as a person. A woman who was terrified and in danger and needed him to be strong. The king appeared on the balcony first, alone, his large frame outlined against the pale morning sky. The crowd below surged and roared, a sea of faces twisted with rage and hunger and something darker, something that looked almost like joy. They called for the queen. They wanted to see her. Wanted to spit at her, curse at her, maybe worse. Louis stood there, hands gripping the railing, and tried to speak, but his words were swallowed by the noise. He had never been good at speeches, never had the presence that kings were supposed to have. And now, facing thousands of people who wanted his wife dead, he looked small. Helpless. Human. Lafayette, the general who had fought for American independence and now commanded the National Guard, appeared beside him. He had been negotiating all night, trying to calm the mob, trying to find some solution that did not end in bloodshed. And he had made a promise to the crowd, a promise that terrified everyone inside the palace. The queen would appear. She would show herself. And if she did, if she faced them with courage, perhaps they would let her live. Marie Antoinette stood behind the glass doors, her children clutching at her skirts. Marie-Therese, her daughter, was 11 now, old enough to understand that something terrible was happening but too young to comprehend just how much danger they were in. Louis Charles, her surviving son, the new Dauphin, was only 4, his face pressed against his mother's dress, his small body shaking with each roar from the crowd. They wanted to go with her. They were terrified to let her go alone. But Lafayette shook his head. Just the Queen, he said. Alone. It was the only way. She bent down, kissed each of her children, whispered words she hoped they would remember if this was the last time. Then she straightened, smoothed her dress with hands that no longer trembled, and lifted her chin. The terror was still there, coiled tight in her chest, but she had learned long ago how to hide what she felt, how to wear a mask when the world was watching. She had been doing it since she was 14. And she would do it now, even if it killed her. The doors opened. She stepped out onto the balcony. And the noise hit her like a physical thing, a wall of sound so loud it seemed impossible that human throats could produce it. Thousands of voices screaming, cursing, calling for her blood. She stood there, alone, no crown, no jewels, just a woman in a simple dress facing the people who hated her more than they had ever hated anyone. Muskets were raised. She could see them clearly, barrels pointed at her chest. One shot. That was all it would take. One person deciding that a dead queen was worth the consequences. Lafayette stepped beside her. He took her hand, raised it to his lips, and kissed it. A gesture of respect, of protection, a signal to the crowd that she was under his authority, that the National Guard would defend her. It was a gamble. A desperate, impossible gamble. The crowd could have surged forward anyway, could have torn through the guards and ripped her apart. But something shifted. The roaring quieted, just a little. People lowered their weapons, just an inch. And Marie Antoinette, sensing the moment, did the only thing she could think of. She curtsied. A deep, graceful curtsy, the kind she had been taught as a child, the kind that acknowledged the crowd not as a mob but as her people. She bowed to them. And for a moment, just a moment, they saw not the monster from the pamphlets, but a woman. Frightened. Brave. Human. The crowd erupted again, but this time it was different. Not quite cheering, but not entirely hostile either. Confusion, maybe. Uncertainty. Enough to keep her alive. Lafayette led her back inside, and she collapsed the moment the doors closed, her legs giving out, her whole body shaking with delayed terror. She had survived. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that this was not mercy. It was only a postponement. They left Versailles that afternoon, the entire royal family packed into carriages surrounded by the mob. It was not a procession. It was a parade of captives. The crowd marched alongside them, singing, laughing, carrying pikes topped with the heads of guards who had been killed during the morning's violence. Marie Antoinette sat rigid in the carriage, her children pressed against her, her eyes staring straight ahead as they passed beneath those severed heads, as blood dripped onto the carriage roof. She did not cry. She would not give them that satisfaction. But inside, something was breaking, some final piece of hope that maybe this could still end without complete disaster. Paris was waiting. The people lined the streets, thousands upon thousands of them, and as the carriage rolled past they shouted and jeered and threw things, rotten food and stones and clumps of mud. The king and queen are coming back, someone yelled, bringing bread with them. As if the royal family could solve hunger simply by being present. As if their presence was a magic cure for problems that had been decades in the making. The crowd did not care about nuance. They did not care that the bread shortage was caused by weather and war and a broken economic system. They had their villains now. And villains could be punished. The Tuileries Palace became their new prison. It was smaller than Versailles, darker, with walls that felt too close and windows that looked out onto streets full of people who wanted them dead. Guards were posted at every entrance, not to protect the royal family but to make sure they could not escape. The National Assembly met nearby, close enough that Marie Antoinette could sometimes hear the debates, could hear her name being spat like a curse as they discussed what to do with the monarchy, whether to keep the king as a powerless figurehead or abolish the institution entirely. She tried to adapt. Tried to make this new life bearable for her children, who did not understand why they could not go home, why their mother looked so tired all the time, why strange men in revolutionary cockades stood outside their bedroom doors. She played games with them, read them stories, sang them songs, anything to preserve some small piece of normalcy in a world that had gone insane. But it was getting harder. Every day brought new restrictions, new humiliations, new evidence that they were not guests but prisoners. Letters arrived from Austria. Her brother Leopold, the emperor, wrote that he was watching the situation with concern but could not intervene. Austria had its own problems, its own revolutions brewing, and he could not risk war with France to save one sister. She read his words and felt the last door close. She was truly alone now. No family to rescue her. No allies willing to fight for her. Just herself, her weak husband, and her children in a palace surrounded by enemies. And still the pamphlets came. More vicious than ever, more obscene, more determined to strip away any remaining shred of her humanity. They depicted her as a monster who drank the blood of children, as a lesbian who corrupted noble ladies, as an Austrian spy sending state secrets to her brother. They called her Madame Deficit, blamed her for a national debt that was beyond any one person's ability to create or solve. They printed fake confessions where she admitted to affairs, to plots, to crimes that existed only in the fevered imagination of revolutionaries who needed her to be evil because if she was just a woman, just a mother, just a person who had made mistakes but not committed treason, then what they were planning to do to her would be murder rather than justice. The king tried to escape. In June of 1791, they made a run for it, the whole family disguised as servants, traveling by night toward the border where Austrian troops were supposedly waiting. It was a desperate plan, poorly executed, doomed from the start. They were recognized in a small town called Versailles. The revolution had printed so many images of them, so many caricatures and portraits, that even peasants who had never been to Paris knew their faces. They were stopped. Surrounded. Dragged back to Paris in a journey that took days, the carriage moving at a crawl through hostile crowds while guards kept the windows covered so no one could shoot inside. After Versailles, everything changed. Before, there had been debate about whether to keep the monarchy. After, there was only the question of when and how to end it. The king and queen were no longer even pretending to be free. They were enemies of the revolution now, traitors caught trying to flee, proof that they could not be trusted. Marie Antoinette knew what was coming. She could feel it in the way people looked at her, in the way guards spoke to her, in the silence that fell whenever she entered a room. They were deciding how to kill her. It was only a matter of time. The Tuileries became a tomb where the living waited to die. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, and the seasons changed outside the windows while inside time seemed to stop entirely. Marie Antoinette aged years in those imprisoned months. Her hair, which had been golden, turned white almost overnight. Not gradually, the way hair grays with age, but suddenly, as if fear itself had bleached the color from every strand. She was only 36, but when she looked in the mirror she saw an old woman staring back, hollow-eyed and gaunt, a ghost wearing her face. The children kept her alive. They were the only reason she got out of bed each morning, the only reason she forced herself to eat when food tasted like ashes, to smile when smiling felt like her face might crack. Marie-Therese was growing into a young woman, serious and watchful, old beyond her years. She understood now what was happening, understood that they were in danger, and she stayed close to her mother like a shadow, as if physical proximity could somehow protect them both. Louis Charles, the Dauphin, was still young enough to believe that tomorrow might be better, that this strange situation was temporary, that soon they would go home and everything would be like it was before. But there was no before anymore. That world had ended. Versailles stood empty now, its fountains dry, its gardens overgrown, its halls stripped of furniture and art by revolutionaries who saw every painting, every tapestry, every gilded chair as proof of aristocratic excess. The palace that had been her prison had at least been beautiful. This new prison was ugly, cramped, filled with hostile guards and the constant noise from the streets, crowds that gathered daily outside the Tuileries to shout insults and sing revolutionary songs and occasionally throw stones at the windows. The revolution was eating itself. That was what happened when you built a movement on rage rather than reason, when you promised that destroying the old world would automatically create a better one. The moderates who had wanted constitutional monarchy were losing ground to radicals who wanted blood. The radicals who wanted blood were being challenged by even more extreme factions who thought the first wave of executions had not gone far enough. And caught in the middle were the royal family, symbols of everything the revolution claimed to oppose, kept alive only because different factions could not agree on how and when to kill them. War came. Austria and Prussia, alarmed by the revolution and the treatment of the French king, declared war on France in the spring of 1792. It was supposed to be a quick victory, a rescue mission that would restore order and save Louis and Marie Antoinette from the mob. Instead, it gave the revolutionaries exactly what they needed, an external enemy, proof that foreign powers were trying to crush the revolution, justification for increasingly brutal measures against anyone suspected of royalist sympathies. And Marie Antoinette, the Austrian, became not just a bad queen but an active traitor, a spy sending military secrets to her nephew the emperor, a woman who wanted French soldiers to die so that her family could be restored to power. She had sent letters. That much was true. Desperate letters to her family begging for help, for intervention, for anything that might save her children. But she had not sent military secrets because she did not have access to any. She was a prisoner, watched constantly, her mail read before it was allowed to leave, her visitors interrogated. The accusations were fantasies, paranoid delusions from revolutionaries who needed her to be a traitor because that made what they were planning easier to justify. August brought heat and madness in equal measure. Paris sweltered under a sun that seemed to press down on the city like a weight, and tempers that were already frayed snapped completely. The war was going badly. French forces were retreating. Rumors spread that Austrian armies were marching on Paris, that they would slaughter every revolutionary, that the streets would run with blood. And someone needed to be blamed. The mob turned its eyes toward the Tuileries, toward the royal family who sat behind stone walls while French soldiers died. On the 10th of August, they came again. Not a crowd of hungry women this time, but an army. National Guardsmen who had defected to the radical cause, sans-culottes wearing the red caps of revolution, citizens who had armed themselves with pikes and muskets and knives. They surrounded the palace at dawn, and this time there would be no negotiation, no last-minute reprieve. This time they wanted blood. The Swiss guards, still loyal to the king, defended the Tuileries with a courage that was as futile as it was admirable. They held the gates, fired into the crowd, fought hand-to-hand in the courtyards while Louis and his family were rushed through back passages toward the National Assembly building nearby. Behind them, the palace fell. The guards were overwhelmed, cut down, some of them killed while they tried to surrender. The mob poured through the halls, smashing everything, destroying what they could not carry away, turning the Tuileries into a slaughterhouse. The royal family reached the assembly building and were shut inside a small room, little more than a closet, while outside the deputies debated what to do with them. They could hear the arguments through the walls, voices rising and falling, some calling for the king to be protected, others demanding he be put on trial immediately. Marie Antoinette held her children close, their faces pressed against her dress so they would not have to see the fear in her eyes. Louis sat with his head in his hands, all the color drained from his face, looking like a man who had finally realized that hoping for the best would not make it come true. They were moved that night to the Temple, a medieval fortress in the Marais district that had once belonged to the Knights Templar. It was a real prison now, no pretense of royal apartments or courtesy. Stone walls, narrow windows with bars, guards who did not even pretend respect. The family was split up, put in separate rooms, allowed to see each other only at mealtimes and always under supervision. Everything they said was reported. Everything they did was watched. They were being studied like specimens, dissected while still alive, their every gesture analyzed for signs of plots or escape attempts. Marie Antoinette's room was on the third floor of the tower, small and damp and cold even in summer. A bed, a chair, a table. Nothing else. She could hear her children in the rooms nearby, could hear her daughter crying sometimes at night, but she was not allowed to go to them outside the designated hours. So she sat on her bed and stared at the stone walls and tried to remember what hope felt like. September came with massacres. Prisons across Paris were stormed by mobs who dragged out prisoners, accused aristocrats and priests and anyone suspected of counter-revolutionary sympathy, and butchered them in the streets. Over 1,000 people died in 3 days, killed without trial, without mercy, their bodies left to rot in the gutters while the city descended into a bloodlust that felt almost medieval. The revolution had crossed a line. It was no longer about ideals or justice or building a better world. It was about killing. Pure and simple. At the temple, the royal family heard the screams. They were close enough that sound carried through the windows, close enough that they could hear the mob singing between murders. Marie Antoinette sat with her children and tried to comfort them, tried to tell them everything would be all right, but she could not make her voice sound convincing anymore. Her daughter looked at her with eyes that were too old, too knowing. "They are going to kill us, aren't they, maman?" And Marie Antoinette, who had spent her entire adult life lying for the sake of propriety, found she could not lie to her child. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know." One of the people killed in September was the Princesse de Lamballe, Marie Antoinette's closest friend. They had grown up together at Versailles, had laughed and danced and shared secrets the way young women do, had stayed loyal to each other even when the court turned toxic and friendships became dangerous. The mob dragged her from her cell, demanded she denounce the queen, and when she refused they killed her. Raped her. Dismembered her. Paraded her head through the streets on a pike. And then they brought that pike to the temple, held it up to Marie Antoinette's window so she would see what they had done to her friend, so she would understand exactly what waited for her. She did not scream. Did not faint. She looked at what was left of her friend, at the head with its blood-matted hair and empty eyes, and something inside her went still. Cold. She had reached the bottom of fear, the place where there was nothing left to lose, nothing left to break. They could kill her. They probably would. But they could not hurt her anymore. She was already destroyed. The king's trial began in December. They brought him before the National Convention, now the supreme authority in revolutionary France, and read out charges of treason. Conspiring with foreign powers. Plotting against the revolution. Crimes against the people. Louis tried to defend himself, his voice shaking, his arguments weak and unconvincing because what defense was there really? He had been king. He had ruled by divine right. He had believed that his authority came from God and that subjects owed him obedience. The revolution had made all of that a crime. Marie Antoinette was not allowed to attend the trial. She sat in her cell and waited, knowing how it would end. They brought Louis back to the temple for a final night with his family, a last dinner where everyone pretended they did not know this was goodbye. The children clung to their father. Marie Antoinette sat rigid, her face a mask, because if she started crying she knew she would never stop. Louis tried to be strong for them, tried to smile and tell them to be brave, but his eyes were red and his hands trembled when he blessed each of them. He was executed on January 21, 1793. They woke Marie Antoinette with the sound of drums, the procession passing near the temple on its way to the Place de la Révolution where the guillotine waited. She stood at her window, straining to hear, to somehow know the moment it happened. And when it came, when the drums stopped and the crowd roared, she fell to her knees. Not in grief. She had gone beyond grief. But in a kind of terrible understanding. Her husband was dead. Her children were orphans. And she was next. They took away her name the day after they killed her husband. No more Marie Antoinette, Queen of France. Now she was simply the widow Capet, a reference to the medieval dynasty from which the French royal line descended, a way of stripping her of everything that had defined her for 2 decades. She was not royal anymore. She was not even Austrian. She was just a woman waiting to die, and they wanted to make sure she knew it. The guards became crueler. Before, there had been at least a veneer of respect, a recognition that however much they hated her, she was still technically a queen. Now that pretense vanished. They called her obscene names, made crude jokes about what they would like to do to her, left her chamber pot unemptied for days so that the smell became unbearable. They watched her dress, watched her undress, allowed her no privacy, no dignity, nothing that might let her feel human for even a moment. It was deliberate humiliation, a systematic attempt to break her before they killed her. She endured. What choice did she have? She woke each morning in the cold stone room, wrapped herself in the thin blankets that did nothing to keep out the damp, and focused on the only thing that still mattered. Her children. They were still in the temple, still close enough that she could sometimes hear their voices through the walls. Marie-Therese in the room above, Louis Charles somewhere below. As long as she could hear them, as long as she knew they were alive, she could survive anything. But even that was taken from her. In July, they came for her son. The little boy who was 8 years old now, who still called for his mother at night, who did not understand why the world had become so dark and frightening. They dragged him from his room while Marie Antoinette screamed and pounded on her locked door, her voice raw with a desperation that the guards ignored. They were taking him away. Taking him to be raised by a cobbler named Simon, a brutal man who had been given one task: make the boy forget he was ever royal. Make him hate his mother. Turn him into a revolutionary. She never saw him again. For 3 months she lived in that cell hearing nothing of her son, not knowing if he was alive or dead, if they were hurting him, if he was crying for her. The not knowing was worse than any physical torture. It hollowed her out, left her a shell that moved and breathed but felt nothing because feeling would mean going mad. Her hair, already white, began falling out in clumps. Her hands developed a constant tremor. She stopped eating, not deliberately, but because food seemed pointless when her body was just a thing keeping her conscious for more suffering. In August, they moved her. Not to better quarters, but to the conciergerie, the prison attached to the Palace of Justice where those awaiting trial were held. It was underground, damp and cold and crawling with rats. Her cell was tiny, barely 6 feet by 9, with a straw mattress on a wooden frame and a single chair. The walls wept moisture. The air smelled of sewage and despair. This was where they brought people to break them before execution, and Marie Antoinette, looking around at the stone walls that would be her last home, understood that she was looking at her tomb. They gave her 2 guards who sat in her cell constantly, watching her every moment. She could not sleep without them staring. Could not use the chamber pot without them watching. Could not cry without them reporting it. They were chosen specifically to humiliate her, rough men who made sure she knew they considered her nothing but a whore who had gotten above herself. One of them liked to describe in detail what the guillotine would feel like, how the blade would cut, how long she might stay conscious after her head was severed. He thought it was funny. She learned to look through him as if he did not exist. The trial was scheduled for October. They gave her almost no time to prepare, no real access to lawyers, no opportunity to gather evidence or witnesses in her defense. Not that it mattered. The trial was theater, a performance designed to give revolutionary justice a veneer of legitimacy before they did what they had already decided to do. The charges were absurd, a mixture of old accusations and new lies stitched together into something that would have been laughable if it were not being used to justify murder. They accused her of sending millions to Austria, despite the fact that her correspondence had been monitored and no such transfers existed. They accused her of organizing the massacre of patriots, despite her having been a prisoner with no power to organize anything. They accused her of plotting with foreign powers, despite every letter she had sent being read and nothing resembling a plot ever being found. And then they brought out the worst charge, the one designed not to convict her in law but to destroy her in the eyes of anyone who might still feel sympathy. They accused her of sexually abusing her son. Of committing incest with the 8-year-old boy they had taken from her. The accusation came from testimony they had forced from Louis Charles, coached by Simon the cobbler, a child so traumatized and confused that he would have said anything to make the adults stop questioning him. The revolutionaries knew it was a lie. But they also knew it was the kind of lie that would make people hate her beyond reason, that would transform any remaining sympathy into revulsion. The trial began on October 14, 1793. They brought Marie Antoinette into the courtroom after midnight, exhausted from interrogations, so weak she could barely stand. She had been hemorrhaging for months, some kind of internal bleeding that the prison doctors ignored, and she was in constant pain. But she stood before her accusers with her head high, her voice steady, and for the first time in years she was not playing a role. She was simply herself. A woman who had nothing left to lose. They read the charges. She listened without expression to accusations of orgies and treason and financial crimes. She answered calmly, clearly, pointing out the contradictions and impossibilities in the prosecution's case. When they accused her of sending money to Austria, she explained that she had no access to treasury funds, that all expenses had been approved by ministers she never met. When they accused her of plotting massacres, she noted that she had been a prisoner under constant guard. Her answers were intelligent, measured, the responses of someone who understood she was not really on trial but who refused to make it easy for them. And then they brought up the incest charge. The public prosecutor, a man named Hébert, described in graphic detail what Louis Charles had supposedly said, painting a picture of depravity so vile that people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. Marie Antoinette sat silent through it all, her face growing paler, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. And when he finally finished, when he asked if she had anything to say to these accusations, she rose to her feet. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but clear. It carried through the courtroom to every corner, to every person who had come to watch the spectacle of a fallen queen being destroyed. I appeal to all mothers present, she said, looking not at her judges but at the women in the public gallery, the market women and shopkeepers' wives who had come to jeer. Is such a crime possible? The room fell absolutely silent. For just a moment, the mask slipped. These women, who had called her the Austrian whore, who had sung songs about feeding her to the guillotine, looked at this pale, bleeding, white-haired woman and saw what they had been refusing to see. A mother. Accused of something so monstrous that even her worst enemies could not quite believe it. The moment stretched. Expanded. Became dangerous. The prosecutor moved quickly to fill the silence, calling more witnesses, drowning out the doubt with more accusations. But something had shifted. Even some of the revolutionaries in the courtroom looked uncomfortable. The incest charge had been a mistake, too extreme, too cruel, too obviously designed to destroy rather than convict. It made people remember that this was a human being, not just a symbol. And that was dangerous. Sympathy was dangerous. The trial continued through the night and into the next day. 16 hours of testimony, of questions, of accusations piled on accusations. Marie Antoinette answered everything, her voice growing weaker but never breaking. She had not slept in 2 days. Had barely eaten in weeks. Was bleeding through her dress and in too much pain to sit comfortably. But she stood there and defended herself because she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her collapse. The verdict was predetermined. Everyone knew it. At 4 a.m. on October 16, the jury retired to deliberate. They were back in an hour. Guilty on all charges. Sentence, death. To be carried out later that day. Marie Antoinette received the news without reaction, her face a mask of composure that no longer required effort because she had nothing left inside to reveal. She curtsied to the court, a gesture of ironic grace, and was led back to her cell. She had 8 hours left to live. 8 hours to write letters, to think about her children, to prepare herself for what was coming. She wrote to her sister-in-law, a long letter that was part goodbye, part confession, part meditation on forgiveness. She asked that her children be cared for, that her daughter be protected, that Louis Charles be told she loved him even though he had been made to lie. She asked for a priest, a non-juring priest who had refused to swear allegiance to the revolution, and when they refused she prayed alone. They came for her at 10 in the morning. Not in a closed carriage like Louis had been given, but in an open cart, the kind used to transport criminals and garbage through the streets. They wanted her to be seen. Wanted the mob to have one last chance to jeer and curse and throw things. They cut her hair short for the guillotine. Tied her hands behind her back, the ropes so tight they cut into her wrists. Dressed her in a plain white dress, the color of mourning, of purity, of ghosts. The cart rolled slowly through Paris, taking the longest possible route so that maximum numbers of people could witness the Austrian whore being brought to justice. The streets were packed. Thousands of people lined the route, some cheering, some silent, some crying. She sat upright in the cart, her back straight, her head high, looking at no one and nothing. The journey took over an hour, that final hour of humiliation and display, the last performance of a woman who had spent her entire adult life being watched. The Place de la Révolution was enormous, a vast open square that had once been called the Place Louis XV, named after her husband's grandfather. Now it was the execution ground, and the guillotine stood in the center like an altar. The crowd pressed close, thousands of people shoving to get a better view, their faces blurred together into a single mass of eyes and open mouths. She could hear them chanting, singing the revolutionary songs that had become the soundtrack to mass murder. She climbed down from the cart with difficulty, her hands still bound, her legs weak from months of imprisonment and illness. A priest stood nearby, one who had sworn the revolutionary oath, and she ignored him. If she could not have a real priest, she would face God alone. The executioner approached, a man named Sanson, and there was something almost apologetic in the way he touched her elbow to guide her toward the steps. She stumbled. Stepped on his foot accidentally. "Pardon, monsieur," she said automatically, the trained politeness of a lifetime surfacing even now. "I did not do it on purpose." Her last words. An apology to the man who was about to kill her. Something so absurdly, tragically appropriate that if she had scripted it herself it could not have been more perfect. The steps to the scaffold were steep. She climbed them carefully, not from fear but from simple physical necessity. Her body was failing, bleeding, barely functional. But she made it to the top. Made it to the plank where they would strap her down. The crowd noise rose to a roar. She looked out over them one last time, these people who had hated her for so long, who had made her the villain of their revolution, who needed her death to prove that the old world was truly gone. They strapped her down. Face forward, so she could see the basket where her head would fall. The board tipped horizontal. The lunette, the wooden collar, closed around her neck. She closed her eyes. Not from fear. But because she was finally done. Done performing. Done being watched. Done being Marie Antoinette. She could let go now. Could stop holding herself together. Could surrender to the darkness that had been pulling at her for years. The blade fell. It took less than a second. One moment she existed. The next she did not. The executioner lifted her head by the hair, showing it to the crowd, and they cheered. Cheered for the death of a woman who had never asked to be queen, who had been sent to France as a child bride, who had tried and failed to navigate a world that was designed to destroy her. The Austrian whore was dead. The widow Capet was executed. And Marie Antoinette, the girl who had once played harp in Vienna and dreamed of a life she would never be allowed to have, was finally free. Her body was thrown into an unmarked grave in the cemetery of the Madeleine, buried with quicklime to speed decomposition. Her children survived, somehow. Marie-Therese was eventually released and lived to old age, though she never spoke about her mother without weeping. Louis Charles died in prison 2 years later, probably from tuberculosis, abused and neglected, having forgotten the woman who loved him. Her husband's brothers eventually regained the throne, and decades later they had her remains and Louis's exhumed and reburied properly, finally giving her the royal funeral she had been denied. But on that October morning in 1793, as her blood soaked into the sawdust of the scaffold, none of that had happened yet. There was only the end. The blade. The severed head. The roar of the crowd. The revolution consuming its symbols, believing that killing a woman could somehow kill the past. And in a cell somewhere in the temple, a little girl who had just turned 15 sat alone, listening to the sounds from the square, knowing her mother was gone, and wondering if anyone would remember that once, long ago, there had been a woman behind the crown. A person. Not a monster. Just a person who had tried her best and lost everything. The night fell on Paris. And Marie Antoinette, who had been so many things to so many people, became only a ghost. A story. A warning. A tragedy. And finally, after all these years, perhaps just a little bit, a person worth remembering. If this story carried you through the darkness, if it helped you see the human heart beneath the crown, then stay with these voices from the past. They have more to tell. More lives to remember. More ghosts who deserve to be heard. Let history be your companion in the quiet hours. Let the forgotten be remembered. Rest now. The story is complete. And somewhere, in a place beyond guillotines and revolutions and the cruelty of crowds, perhaps Marie Antoinette is finally at peace.